In October 1966, a deep hole began to open beside the houses of Zwaagdijk in North Holland. Men stood around the muddy excavation with hoses, pumps, and lifting equipment, working downward into ground that had looked ordinary for years. To anyone passing nearby, it could have seemed like construction work. It was not. The men were not searching for an aircraft whose location had been forgotten, and they were not chasing a rumor about something buried during the war. They already knew what was beneath them. 25 years earlier, a Royal Air Force Wellington had crashed at this exact place. One member of its crew had been recovered soon afterward. The other 5 had never come back out. The aircraft was Vickers Wellington T2996, coded PMC, of No. 103 Squadron RAF. On the evening of June 12, 1941, it stood at RAF Newton in Nottinghamshire, preparing for another night operation over occupied Europe. At that stage of the war, the Wellington was one of Bomber Command's principal twin-engined bombers. It was not a glamorous machine, in the way later wartime legends would become famous. It was a working bomber, flown night after night by crews who depended on navigation, weather, darkness, and defensive fire to bring them home. T2996 itself was not famous. It carried no nickname that would survive the war. It was not destined for a museum, a restoration hangar, or a preserved flight line. What made it significant came from one mission, one violent impact, and the fact that the crash did not end when the aircraft hit the ground. 6 men were aboard: Robert Stanley Chisholm, William Clifford Taffender, Arthur Vernon John Hardcastle, Alan Greensides, Albert George Burbridge, and John Knox Emsley Horniman. At about 11 that night, T2996 left Newton on an operation directed against Osnabrück. The flight would take the Wellington eastward into occupied Europe, across a defensive system that was becoming more dangerous month by month. Bomber Command's night offensive relied on darkness, but darkness did not make the aircraft invisible. Searchlights could find them. Anti-aircraft batteries could reach them. German night fighters were learning how to intercept bombers crossing the Netherlands and Western Germany. For the 6 men in T2996, the operation lasted less than 2 hours. Shortly after midnight, the Wellington was intercepted over the Netherlands. Later specialist histories attribute the interception to a Messerschmitt Bf 110 crew of 4.NJG1, Hans Rasper and Erich Schreiber. The surviving record does not preserve T2996's final minutes in enough detail to reconstruct the fight. There is no reliable second-by-second account of what happened inside the bomber. What is certain is that it was intercepted, lost, and never returned to England. At about 37 minutes past midnight on June 13th, T2996 crashed at Zwaagdijk. The impact destroyed the Wellington, but it also created the physical problem that would define the site for the next quarter century. Instead of leaving a recognizable bomber scattered only across the surface, the crash drove a substantial part of the aircraft into the ground. Lighter wreckage could remain closer to the top or be thrown away from the main impact point. Heavier components carried on farther. The engines, major structure, and other dense parts penetrated deeply into the wet Dutch soil. This was not an aircraft that could simply be loaded onto trucks after the fire was out. It had buried itself. All 6 crewmen were killed. Yet the immediate recovery did not produce 6 bodies. John Knox Emsley Horniman was found after the crash. He was buried at Bergen in North Holland. The other 5 men were not recovered. Chisholm, Taffender, Hardcastle, Greensides, and Burbridge remained associated with the same known crash site, but physically, they were still somewhere beneath it. That distinction is central to the story, because T2996 was not a bomber that simply vanished for 25 years. People knew where it had gone down. Wartime personnel had reached the crash site. Specialist accounts record that at least 1 wing was salvaged in 1941. A field grave marker was associated with the place. The location was remembered locally. Nobody in 1966 had to rediscover T2996 by following a rumor into the countryside or by searching miles of farmland with detectors. The crash site was known. What was inaccessible was the buried core of it. In 1941, that difference mattered. Recovering exposed wreckage was one thing. Excavating deeply enough to reach an aircraft that had driven engines, bombs, structure, and crew far below the surface was another. The Netherlands was under German occupation. The air war was continuing. New losses were occurring constantly. There was no simple way to turn every deeply buried crash into a major engineering excavation while the war was still being fought. So what could be reached was dealt with. Ornament was recovered and buried. Some aircraft material was removed. The deeper wreck remained. The ground closed over the crash site. Above it, the war continued for almost 4 more years. Then occupation ended. The Netherlands was liberated. The war itself moved rapidly into the past, but the physical arrangement beneath Zwaagdijk changed very little. Fragments of aircraft remained mixed with the soil. Heavier components stayed deep in the impact crater. Bombs remained with the buried wreck, and 5 airmen still had no recovered graves. Horniman did. That created a strange division within one crew. 6 men had left RAF Newton together. 6 had died together in the same aircraft, yet only 1 had been physically recovered from the site. For the next 25 years, that difference remained. Life returned around Zwaagdijk. The crash site was not transformed into a museum or sealed inside a permanent military compound. It remained part of an ordinary landscape. Houses stood nearby. Land was used. New generations knew the war increasingly through memorials, stories, and graves rather than through daily experience. At the surface, the site could become almost normal. Below it, nothing about the basic outcome of the crash had been resolved. This is why T2996 does not fit the usual pattern of a lost aircraft story. There was no dramatic rediscovery in which someone suddenly learned that a Wellington lay beneath the field. The knowledge was already there. The problem was that knowledge alone could not bring the missing men up. A crash site can be mapped and still remain inaccessible. A crew can have a known place of death and still remain missing. A field can look ordinary while containing an aircraft impact crater that extends many feet below the surface. By the middle of the 1960s, the wreck had been underground for roughly a quarter of a century. Local histories record that plans to build on the property helped force a decision about what remained beneath it. The exact administrative sequence is less well documented than the excavation itself, but the practical result is clear. The site could no longer simply be treated as ordinary ground. If the land was going to be used differently, the buried wartime wreck had to be addressed. Royal Netherlands Air Force recovery personnel became involved. The operation they faced was not the kind of salvage that produces a single dramatic lift. There was no intact Wellington lying on its belly beneath a shallow layer of earth. No crane could attach cables to the fuselage and raise the bomber as one object. The impact had already broken that possibility apart in 1941. The only way forward was to excavate. The surviving photographs from 1966 show how quickly the site changed once the work began. What had been an ordinary patch of ground became a broad, muddy pit beside existing houses. Men stood at the rim and worked lower down inside the excavation. Hoses ran into the hole. Pumps were used as water entered the site. Earth was removed in stages as the recovery team followed the wreckage downward. The scene is striking because of how close the wartime crash sits to normal post-war life. A house is only a short distance away. Workers stand beside fences and buildings. And in the middle of that familiar landscape is a hole descending into the remains of a bomber lost in 1941. The excavation did not reveal T2996 all at once. It appeared in fragments. Pieces of structure came out first. Other components lay deeper. The farther the team worked down, the clearer it became that the impact had not created a neat underground outline of an aircraft. The Wellington had broken apart as it entered the earth. Heavy pieces had continued farther than light ones. Soil had collapsed around the wreck. Water had moved through it. 25 years of corrosion had altered the metal again. The result was not a preserved bomber. It was an impact site. That difference shaped everything the recovery team saw. A wing or fuselage section on the surface can still resemble part of an aircraft. Underground, after a high-energy crash, components can be bent, broken, and displaced. Pieces that once belonged several meters apart inside the airframe can end up mixed within the same crater. Identifiable wreckage may appear at one level, while the heaviest components lie far below it. This is why the excavation kept going. The first pieces did not mean the work was finished. The pit became deeper. More aircraft material emerged. Water had to be controlled, and because T2996 had been on an operational bombing mission, the men were not dealing only with broken aluminum and steel. Specialist histories record bombs among the objects recovered from the site. That changed the character of the work again. The team was opening ground that contained the wreckage of a bomber, wartime ordnance, and the remains of 5 men who had never been recovered. None of those could simply be treated as scrap. As the excavation deepened, the scale of the original crash became easier to understand. Specialist accounts placed the engines and bombs at roughly 6 meters below the surface, close to 20 feet. That single measurement explains more than any complicated engineering description. 20 feet is not a shallow burial. It is deeper than the height of a typical one-story building. To reach the heaviest parts of T2996, the recovery team had to open a substantial excavation in wet ground while working beside homes and through material that had been violently compressed into the soil. The people of Zwaagdijk had always known where the Wellington fell. Now the recovery team was finding out how far down it had gone. The photographs capture that change in scale. At the beginning, the site is a patch of ground. Then it becomes a work area, then a pit, then a deep excavation in which the men at the bottom appear small compared with the walls around them. The airplane itself never returns as a recognizable whole. Instead, the story moves downward through layers. Surface debris, broken structure, larger pieces, heavy components, bombs, and then something more important than any part of the aircraft: human remains. At that point, the meaning of the excavation changed completely. The men working at Zwaagdijk were no longer simply recovering a wartime machine. They were reaching members of a crew whose fate had been physically unresolved since the night the Wellington crashed. The remains recovered from the site were identified with the 5 men still missing from T2996: Robert Stanley Chisholm, William Clifford Taffender, Arthur Vernon John Hardcastle, Alan Greensides, Albert George Burbridge. All 5 were recovered in 1966. No invented dialogue is needed here. No imagined reaction from the recovery team is necessary. The fact itself is enough. For 25 years, these men had remained beneath a known crash site. Their aircraft was known. Their names were known. The place where they died was known. But their remains had not been brought out. Now they had. That result finally closed the gap created in 1941. Horniman had been recovered in the immediate aftermath of the crash. His 5 crewmates had remained below the field through the rest of the occupation, through liberation, through the end of the war, and through more than 2 decades of peace. One crew had effectively been divided by the depth of the impact. 1 man reached a grave in 1941. 5 more reached graves only in 1966. The Wellington itself offered no comparable recovery. There was no possibility that T2996 would emerge from the field as a complete aircraft. The same forces that buried it had destroyed it. 25 years underground had added corrosion and deterioration to wreckage already shattered by impact. Engines could be removed. Bombs could be dealt with. Fragments of fuselage and other structure could come out. But there was no surviving airframe around which a restoration could realistically be built. T2996 would not become one of those recovery stories in which a rare aircraft is raised from a lake, transported to a workshop, and gradually returned to its original shape. It would never stand again as a complete Wellington. It would never taxi. It would never fly. The importance of the 1966 operation lay somewhere else. The aircraft came out as wreckage. The 5 missing men came out as recovered dead. After the excavation, Chisholm, Taffender, Hardcastle, Greensides, and Burbridge were buried at Jonkerbos War Cemetery near Nijmegen. Their graves lie close together. Horniman remained at Bergen, where he had been buried since 1941. That means the crew that flew together on the night of June 12th was never reunited in one cemetery. The timing of their recovery had separated them permanently. The division had nothing to do with where they had served or how they had died. It came from what the crash site allowed people to reach. Horniman had been accessible in 1941. The other 5 were not. That is one of the quietest consequences of the impact at Zwaagdijk. The crash lasted seconds. Its recovery history lasted 25 years. By the time the 5 men were brought out, almost everything around their story had changed. The German occupation was history. The night fighter units that had hunted RAF bombers over the Netherlands were gone. Bomber Command's wartime campaign had become the subject of memorials and history books. The Wellington itself had passed out of frontline service. RAF Newton belonged to a different era from the one in which T2996 had departed at 11 at night. Yet beneath the Dutch field, the 5 missing crewmen had remained where the aircraft placed them in 1941. The recovery of 1966 finally ended that physical continuity. Once the excavation was complete, the site could return to the surface world. The pit was not a permanent monument. The houses remained. The land could be used again. But the meaning of the place had changed. It was still the crash site of Wellington T2996. It was still the point where 6 men had died. But it was no longer the unresolved burial place of 5 missing RAF airmen. In later years, the location was marked more deliberately. A propeller monument now stands at Zwaagdijk 30, on the property associated with the crash. Specialist historical records date the monument to 2001. It is a simple marker compared with the scale of the aircraft that once flew above the site. It is also simple compared with the excavation that opened the ground there in 1966. But the propeller stands in exactly the kind of place that makes the story powerful. Not on an airfield, not in a large aviation museum, not beside a restored Wellington. It stands on the ground where a bomber disappeared into the earth and where 5 of its crew remained for a quarter of a century. Today, there is no dramatic aircraft wreck visible at Zwaagdijk. The most important objects recovered from the site were never going to be restored. Horniman rests at Bergen. Chisholm, Taffender, Hardcastle, Greensides, and Burbridge rest at Jonkerbos. The crew is divided between cemeteries, just as its recovery was divided between 2 moments separated by 25 years. That is what gives T2996 its unusual place among wartime aircraft recoveries. Nothing essential about the crash location was forgotten. The aircraft did not need to be rediscovered. The mystery was not where it had fallen. The question was whether the ground would ever be opened deeply enough to reach what was still inside it. For 25 years, the answer was no. Then, in 1966, the surface was cut away. The pit deepened. Water was pumped out. Wreckage emerged. Bombs and engines were reached roughly 20 feet below ground. And finally, the 5 men who had remained missing since June 1941 were recovered from the same field where their Wellington had disappeared. The machine returned only in fragments. The crew returned in 2 different generations. Horniman in 1941, the other 5 in 1966. No restoration could undo what happened shortly after midnight on June 13, 1941. T2996 had been destroyed. Its final mission had ended in occupied Netherlands, and nothing recovered later could change that. But the excavation changed something that mattered more than the condition of the aircraft. Before 1966, 5 of the 6 men were still missing beneath a known crash site. Afterward, they had recovered graves. That is why the photographs of the excavation remain so powerful. They do not show the resurrection of a rare bomber. They show an ordinary Dutch property being opened because part of the war had remained physically unfinished beneath it. They show men descending into a crater that had been hidden beneath normal life for 25 years. And they show the difference between knowing where an aircraft crashed and truly recovering what it carried with it. Today, a propeller marks the site. The field no longer holds the 5 missing airmen of T2996. The Wellington never returned as an aircraft. Its crew never returned together. But after the excavation of 1966, none of the 6 was still missing beneath that Dutch ground. The aircraft remained a wreck. The 5 men were missing no longer.